What's up everyone, Alex here. One thing that I wished more RPGs would have is co-op. Even before I got married, I've always wanted to experience an epic RPG with friends and family alike. Sure, there's always the ever-reliable MMO genre to deliver on this promise, but how about traditional single-player games, whose stories have a defined end? Games like Secret of Mana, for instance, where up to 3 players can go on a journey to save the world together. Trinity Trigger takes its inspirations heavily from said game, employing many key individuals who have worked on the Mana series over the years. With such a beloved game used as a springboard to create something new, one has to wonder, did Trinity Trigger manage to uncover the secrets to the Mana series' early successes? Trinity Trigger is an action RPG that features local co-op, developed by Furyu and published by XSEED. The footage that you're seeing right now is from the PS5 version of the game, and I'd like to thank XSEED for providing me with this review code. One look at Trinity Trigger's combat, and you might mistake it for a new Secret of Mana, and I can't even fault you for that. For anyone unfamiliar with said game, Trinity Trigger's combat revolves around a segmented stamina system that ticks one segment down each time you attack. Unlike other stamina-based action games, however, you're still able to continue on the offensive despite it being empty, though you won't inflict as much damage should you continue to do so. Thankfully, there's ways to get back the stamina. You can disengage from battle and wait for it to build up, or you can do timed dodges to completely replenish it. And before you ask, these dodge rolls don't cost any stamina at all. Things can get hectic in Trinity Trigger, so one way to calm things down a bit is to pull up the item ring, which pauses gameplay, to remove any sort of negative status effects inflicted on your party, or use curatives to get people's HP back up. You can also bring up a weapon wheel, which also pauses gameplay to swap to a brand new weapon. You'll want to do this because the enemies in Trinity Trigger have a weapon weakness that you'll have to take advantage of. Watching any gameplay of Trinity Trigger might make you think that this is your typical Zelda-style action RPG. But due to the addition of stamina, as well as the inclusion of item and weapon rings, all borrowed from Secret of Mana, the action is a little bit broken up than it looks. And with the addition of weapon weaknesses, the action is broken up even more. On paper, Trinity Trigger wants you to equip your heroes with different weapon types, and have you switch between them to take advantage of enemy weaknesses. But by doing that, you're also ensuring that your allies won't effectively attack enemies, dealing less damage in the process. This winds up having you switch your current character's weapon to the one the enemy is weak to, requiring you to pull up the weapon ring to swap things out, and pausing the action on screen. And if you've got multiple enemies with multiple weaknesses, you'd have to do the same thing for every character in your party that has said weapon, pausing the action even more. As of this writing, there's no way to quickly switch weapons per character that keeps you in the thick of action. This also doesn't consider the inclusion of other players to the mix, especially if you're running with a full party of 3, where you simply cannot change characters at all. And given how some characters are stuck with the same weapon for a decent chunk of time, having certain players deal middling damage just isn't satisfying. And in case you thought of playing the game with other players locally, you'll have to play through the game for a couple or so hours until you get all 3 party members to even unlock co-op, even if you only want to play with one other person. While I think the addition of timed dodges is a great way to incentivize players to be daring with their offensive, the game's first bosses simply have too much startup animation that it actually makes their attacks trickier to dodge. In other action RPGs, the startup animations don't normally take too long, and instead have longer attack animations to help players take advantage of this wider window. In fact, one thing that these action RPGs do to test players later on is to introduce longer startup animations to trick them to dodge sooner rather than later, which is the case for Trinity Trigger's earlier boss encounters. And speaking of boss encounters, these guys are just way too spongy. Not only are you asked to whittle down a shield that prevents you from damaging bosses directly, but you'll also need to scramble to damage the boss while the shield is down. Now, granted, these types of mechanics have been present in other action games before, but the amount of damage you have to inflict is far too much for the kind of rudimentary challenge each boss gives you. The dungeon design is also a point of contention, as it's merely presented as a series of boxy corridors with a few challenges strewn about here and there. One dungeon has icy floors that somehow let you turn on a dime for some reason, while another has you smacking mushrooms to provide temporary lighting to the area. In short, these designs feel very antiquated, which is a shame given that the overworld map is full of variety and flavor that makes you wonder if the developers tried to cut corners here. There's also the issue of side quests that you can pick up being marked on the map, but not marked whenever you need to turn them in, as well as the proclivity of certain side quests to just warp you back to the quest giver without your approval. The inconsistency of side quest behavior and quality of life can get frustrating over time, and certainly not adhering to any one standard. And lastly, the one thing that will make turn-based RPG fans quiver in their boots is that the game has bad party AI. Yes, this is one of those games where your characters will stand in the middle of an attack circle, perhaps due to being stuck on an internal AI loop that we have no control over, as Trinity Trigger has zero ways to call upon the AI to snap them out of this funk. This is one of those action games where you really need to babysit your party members, and only a full party of real players will help you avoid this unnecessary nuisance. Saying Trinity Trigger has problems is a bit of an understatement, and much of it really has to do with two things. One, the addition and over-designing of new features with little understanding of how it affects the gameplay loop borrowed from Secret of Mana, and two, a seeming detachment from players' expectations of what modern party-based action RPGs should implement. These two things ripple across the entirety of Trinity Trigger's design, affecting every single facet of the experience in ways that could have been corrected. Unfortunately, given that the game has been out in Japan for months, the hope of new patches to fix any of these seem unlikely. All that said, there are glimmers of greatness in Trinity Trigger that I wish the developers focused on. I mentioned, for instance, that while the dungeon designs were underwhelming, that the overworld designs are actually quite fun to traverse. It's really cool that the game even tells us how many treasure chests we found in each area, invoking that sense of exploration that classic 16-bit JRPGs have drilled into us. And while the moment-to-moment action might be punctuated with too much pausing, the ability to customize the combo strings for each of your weapons helps give its combat some flavor. By changing and upgrading these, you're able to manage crowds easier, allowing you to focus on the game's core mechanics and deal lots of damage. You'll also unlock new weapons for each character, simply by progressing through the story, allowing for a variety of gameplay options that you can experiment with. And I'll even readily admit that the crafting aspect of the game is pretty fun too. There's even a great character in the form of Xantis, the third party member you'll encounter in the game. Xantis brings some life and joy into Trinity Trigger that none of the other playable characters were able to bring in. Top it off with an intriguing backstory, and this character instantly became my favorite. When I look back at my experience with Trinity Trigger, I frequently think about how it's a massively missed opportunity. You'd think that with a dream team of Mana veterans leading the charge, that the resulting game would be a hit, an instant shoo-in for RPG of the Year. Instead, I see a game that's just as conflicted in its design as I am with it. And while I am reluctant to bring up prices of games in my reviews, its $60 price tag is asking way too much for what it actually delivers. Trinity Trigger is a game whose creation is a tale of hubris, a warning of sorts, showing that no matter how good its inspiration was, merely lifting its elements wholesale while tacking on new things isn't enough to capture the splendor of its nostalgia. And nostalgia, after all, can be a dangerous thing to wield.